Hello. Today I chat with Andrés Gómez Emilsson, who is the Director of Research and President at the Qualia Research Institute, which is a consciousness institute. And Andrés, in my opinion, is doing some of the best work on where we're headed with consciousness and what is consciousness. And he does it in this amazing way where it's informed, deeply by physics and math, and it's also informed by not just our normal states of consciousness, but these kind of psychedelic and meditative states of consciousness. And so we kind of dive into all of that, and also, chat about what it means for artificial intelligences to be conscious, and that he thinks that they are not currently conscious, but it's an inevitable fact of reality that they will become conscious. And so when that happens, how to make them only experience positive emotions. So there's a lot of kind of juicy topics here and juicy research questions to explore in the future. And so I hope you enjoy this episode today with Andrés. Thanks. Hello, Rhys's Pieces. I'm Rhys, the co-founder of Root, and welcome to the Rhys Show. I believe that the best way to predict the future is to build it. And so I'm interviewing pioneers on the frontier to understand what the world will look like and the secrets behind how they're building it. These are insights from the frontier. And today I'm excited to chat with Andrés Gómez Emilsson. Andrés is this brilliant consciousness researcher who is the current president of the Qualia Research Institute. Andrés, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. And it's one of those beautiful kind of when parasocial relationships become, a combo social, because you have, I've just watched some of Andres's, and we've met in person as well, but like it's like when you watch like a funny YouTuber and, Andrés has these amazing YouTube videos where he'll just spend an hour or two just like talking to the screen about consciousness. And so now we're going to kind of dive into those ideas and how Andrés thinks about consciousness, and then kind of apply that to artificial intelligence and see how Andrés is thinking about whether these AIs will be conscious or whatever. So, but before we get to that, let's start, Andrés, with just like, I want to ask you first, what got you down this rabbit hole of just like going hard on consciousness?
Oh, wonderful question. I mean, I would describe myself as hyper philosophical in the sense that like I'm constantly wondering about the nature of reality. It's kind of like a condition, really. I mean, I'm kind of like impaired by by that big, worry and concern. So, early on, I thought the way to kind of like understand reality was with math and physics. But around like the age of 16, I realized that consciousness was a much bigger mystery, and that, hey, actually, we have like really good models for physics. We can predict what's going to happen in a particle accelerator. The standard model is amazing. Obviously, physics is not solved yet, but like we're really, really far ahead, right? And then I realized, well, relative to that, consciousness is, baby steps at best. Actually, a term that I really, really like is from David Pearce, where he says that consciousness is currently in a pre-Galilean stage, in that, to give you like a metaphor, this is apocryphal, that apparently didn't really happen, but there's the saying of Galileo giving the priests the option to look through the telescope, and then essentially saying, I don't have to. I already know what is out there because I've read the Bible, right? So there's a bit of I think like that feeling with respect to consciousness. There's like all of these very strange evidence laying around, and we're just not trying to make sense of it. And so essentially, yeah,
Yeah.
just huge opportunity, a huge amount of mysteries. And ultimately, I think what made me decide, like, hey, actually, let's make a career out of these, let's really focus on these, was kind of like getting like the sense that there's like leverage points. There are like very precise things that can actually be investigated that nobody is currently doing, that will hopefully dramatically advance our understanding. So Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, I love that. That's great, dude. No, that's a great. Well, I love you calling it a condition because I think sometimes I see my own stuff as a condition too, where it's like I have a dysmorphic relationship with respect to. And I think for you and for I, it probably started more dysmorphic, but then over time we've learned to like make them more of a positive relationship to like hyper curiosity.
That's right. That's right.
Which is good. And then I also love what you said about like physics. Consciousness is this funny kind of intellectual kind of nerd sniping, which is like, okay, what is actually happening here? And I think that the nice thing with what you're bringing to the table is kind of a more kind of formal kind of physicalism view of like, hey, we're not just philosophy of mind, we're not just psychology or neuroscience or computational neuroscience. Like it has to do all the layers on all the things. And so I think that that's a cool. And then the final bit that you said is I think the frontier is closer than you think. So it's like you're there, you're kind of learning about stuff, and you're like, oh my god, there's leverage points here that you can like push on. And so with that in mind, let's kind of dive into consciousness.
Yeah.
What what is it? What is this thing?
I love that question. So, I mean, first of all, I would say, consciousness, the word is polysemic, just means so many things. Um, I think there's like at least like 10 definitions. I once I like, sat down and found like 20 different ways of talking about. There's like 10 like very common ones. All of them are interesting. All of them are fascinating. All of them are like really worthwhile. You go all the way from like self-awareness, the idea of like, oh, being aware of who you are, all the way to like the problem of perception. Like in what way is it possible that you can open your eyes and you experience, representations of the environment. But there is one sense of the word consciousness, which I think is kind of the deepest and the most profound. And that is consciousness in the sense of qualia, essentially the raw way in which experience presents itself. Classically, when you were a kid, maybe you wondered, is the blue that I see the same blue that other people see? The blueness of blue, it's like, how do you communicate that very, very difficult to express quality of experience? So when I say like, okay, the mystery of consciousness is very deep, usually I'm talking about, the qualia, the way in which experience presents itself. And what is that? Why can that emerge out of essentially, like patterns of what Chalmers describes as form and structure? How can you get this quality of experience out of just form and structure? That's very, very deep, deep puzzle.
Cool. Yeah, got it. So it's like, as you said, there's like something like perception is one part of it reminds me of the previous title for this book that I was writing was What Information Wants. And so I was like, oh, I need to understand information, and there's like 20 different definitions of
Yes.
information. And so similarly for consciousness, all these definitions. And as you say, there's like kind of the simpler form, the like perception form, which might be like a free energy principle, predictive processing. How do we take in sensory data, and then how does it turn into like concepts in our mind or whatever? But there's something almost more fundamental than that, which is this weird word, this qualia, which is that the things almost have like a taste and a texture and a thinginess to it, like a blueness to the blue. It's not just like I am experiencing a zombie reality. It's like, no, I have these kind of perceptual through time moments of like, I'm experiencing blue and now it's green and now I see Andres's face. So okay, so if consciousness is this like qualia, this kind of like movie, this inner movie that's happening that like has kind of a texture to it, how is that occurring to us? Why are we taking as input this kind of cool movie?
Yeah, I mean, I'll point out as well that it's a common misconception to kind of like limit consciousness to like sensory stimuli, because really also, like if you're dreaming, I would say you're conscious even though you're not actually processing sensory input, or not very much. Or if you take the right drug or go on a meditation retreat, you can have really powerful, intense experiences with very little sensory input. You can go to a black room or sensory deprivation tank, so you can really dissociate the two. And likewise, there's like a lot of like textures of qualia that don't correspond to sensory input, like for example, like thought and emotions. You can have thoughts and emotions without like experiencing any sensory input. Uh, so like, yeah, really kind of like the full movie that we are experiencing involves kind of like this assembly of represented sensory input representing internal states, and things such as thoughts. Now, why is this happening? So I could probably launch into okay, like a 1 hour long explanation for like the full model. But I mean, I think like maybe to a first approximation, I will say that, I looked really deeply into the possibility that consciousness is just maybe what it feels like to process information in specific ways. Which would be like a very kind of like natural way of thinking of consciousness is, hey, the brain is a kind of computer, an information processor. So like maybe really that is all there is to it. And actually all of these textures of experience, the quality of consciousness is just different kind of like flavors of computation, flavors of information processing. That's like a very, very convenient. It would be, it would solve a lot of things if that was the case. But then there's a lot of things that like that really doesn't solve. A very, very big topic that I consider very central. It's definitely talked about in neuroscience and in philosophy of mind, but is usually kind of like thought of as a secondary question. I think of it as like very, very primal, is the binding problem. That is, how is it that all of these pieces of information can actually come together into a unified experience, a moment of experience that, kind of creates this collage, all of these sensations simultaneously. Um, and as much as I tried to reason about how like an information processing system would be able to do that, I wasn't able to find like a plausible mechanism. I mean, there's like many attempts you can look into. Yeah, people like Tononi with integrated information theory. They're kind of like looking at emergent, irreducible causality. Or, you can, yeah, look at kind of like the classic functionalists like Hilary Putnam and, their theories of how to make sense of these. But I never able to find like a way to solve the binding problem. So really, I required kind of like a complete reframe of what is going on. And I think I can like, maybe in a couple minutes kind of like articulate the the very big picture.
And
So
before you do,
go
let's
ahead, go
do that in
ahead.
a second. 'Cause, yeah,
Yes.
it's a but yeah, like as you're saying, it is. So we have this movie or whatever, and we're trying to, and it's like, okay, how to, in like the simple frame of this is just like, look, it's what it means to compute. We're just computers who are kind of computing information, computing sensory input, and that is and that kind of gets at some of it, which is like, oh, and that's again like predictive processing, adjacent stuff where you're taking in sensory input and then turning them into concepts or whatever. But a kind of a more crucial kind of piece of this is this binding problem, which is like, how do you get this holistic a moment by moment experience or whatever of like, this is what is now, and now it's now, and now I see the sun, and now I'm tasting strawberries, and like, and to have that experience instead of some kind of just like information and input or something, and here's a concept or whatever. Okay, so I think I get that. And so and by the way, for the listeners to know that there's this great Andres does this great kind of hour-long video on the binding problem. So but tell us, how did you reframe yourself to kind of solve, we can't, because it's hard to bind stuff when you're like, okay, we're trying to like bind the taste of the strawberry with the red of the strawberry, and it sounds like that might be difficult to do or whatever. So how did you kind of reframe the binding problem to solve that?
Yeah, there's a very big kind of like ontological reframe, which, okay, if I say that, probably, it sounds very, very, I don't know, cultish or maybe religious or something, but this has happened in science a whole number of times. And like for me, like a very big inspiration is how electromagnetism came to be. Because in the 19th century, people were like really trying to make sense of electromagnetism in terms of like atoms and forces. It's like, okay, like there's like some particles, they can affect each other at a distance. How do we explain, like a capacitor based on that? Or how do we explain the right hand rule? This like thing that breaks the symmetry because, you're applying one force in one direction and you get a force in an orthogonal direction. Makes no sense. It's a very, very strange behavior. And the truth is, I think you can't actually explain electromagnetism with forces and particles. You need to instead reframe like what reality is made of, and instead realize that, hey, actually reality is made of fields. And the way in which the fields evolve are ruled by these differential equations. So essentially, it's kind of, there's this huge blanket, which can become like tense or curly. It can be twisty, can be kind of like stretched. And the way in which the blanket evolves has to do with how those forces move around in the blanket. And all of a sudden, hey, that has enormous predictive capacity. You can make very strange predictions about what that entails, confirm it in the lab. And yes, it turns out that this field ontology is so much better at making sense of electromagnetism. I think we're going to experience the same in philosophy of mind. There has been a good number of people talking about consciousness as a field, but really have been very marginal, taken as kind of crackpots or at the periphery. I think that's going to be one of the very big revolutions of this century, is reframing, the problem of consciousness from, hey, how do you get all of these discrete neurons to kind of implicitly create, causal structures or information structures that correspond to consciousness, and instead reframe it as, hey, how do you get the fields of physics to essentially get together in the shape of a consciousness, of a human consciousness, and how do you get that shape to be useful for computation? So really, it's kind of rather than thinking of, okay, what information processing leads to consciousness, we turn it on its head and think, oh, what kind of field behavior leads to useful information processing? Because then if we have that, then we have an ontology we can point to and say, yes, that state of the field is a state of consciousness, and it's useful because if you evolve that field according to laws of physics, it can process such and such information.
Cool. Yeah, let me kind of play that back. But yeah, it's like that there's a we've had these kind of paradigm shifts within our understandings of reality through time, and that one of those was in with electromagnetism. And it's funny because I've kind of personally dodged. I think I like to think of electromagnetism as anti-mimetic, just like kind of quantum theory is anti-mimetic. There's things like, passwords that are anti-mimetic. Anything that's in four-dimensional space is anti-mimetic. These are things that are tough for our little brains to get, and it's also tough to share them. And so something like electromagnetism is just kind of like, there's this thing that we can't really see that is hard to understand or whatever. And I guess what you're saying too is that it was especially hard to do when we were kind of viewing it in this kind of simple kind of forces and particles way, which is kind of more natural to us and like feels more like the real world, which is if I push the chair, it like goes, it goes into the other room. And instead, we just need to reframe it in terms of, fields and blankets. And then once you do that, then that kind of metaphor, that kind of conceptual, that concept handle, it really, really helps. So I think that, and it makes me think about this kind of the concept handle of the computer and the computer as a metaphor, and that we've kind of been maximalists at the kind of computer metaphor, which is like society is just a computer and our brains are just a computer and everything's a computer. And now you're saying, no, fields, we talking we're fields, baby. We're fields. We're fields maximalists. So tell us. So now, we have this field, and I was looking at this the other day, the Wikipedia page of like electromagnetism theories of consciousness or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's within this thing where we have our brain. It does have all. I know this is the simple form, but it has all these neurons, these particles that are like doing stuff. How do you take like all these the neurons moving all their electricity around, and how do you view that from a field, and why does that actually help with the binding problem?
Oh, fantastic. These are like super important, very pointed questions. So a lot of like recent evidence indicates that the actual field configurations in the brain are causally significant. So there is a school of thought in neuroscience that sort of thinks of brain waves as kind of just reflecting what is going on in the neurons. The neurons are kind of these gigantic cellular automata that follow discrete rules. And brainwaves is just kind of like, hey, that's kind of like measuring what's going on at the low level, but from a large scale perspective. Then there's like a different school of neuroscience that essentially assigns actual causal effect to the brainwaves, to the actual field configurations. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that. I mean, the field to look into is called emphatic coupling, which is how like the aggregate, statistical activity of neurons manifests as what's called local field potentials. And then those local field potentials, essentially from a top-down perspective, have influence on the probability for neurons to fire. Something that, for example, Jojo McFadden or Susan Pocket postulated, like I think more than a decade ago, was that, hey, a moment of experience might actually be this patchwork of local field potentials. Like if you kind of like aggregate all of these local field potentials, that would kind of like actually contain the information that is expressed in your experience. But there's one problem there, which is that just because you have oscillations in a field, I mean, it solves the problem of how do you integrate the information, because the field is already inherently integrated. But then you actually have a different problem, which we call the boundary problem, which is, well, actually, if the field is, yeah, it's just, universally connected, then how do you actually get to break it down into discrete moments of experience? So you go from the binding problem to the boundary problem. But unlike the binding problem in the forces and particles world, I think the boundary problem in the field world is actually solvable in a fairly straightforward way, which is what we propose, which is topological segmentation. And this is not invoking exotic physics at all. Like topological phenomena in electromagnetic field is like a very active, extremely broad area of research. It's very formal science. This is not, I'm not postulating like a new, physics phenomena that have never been observed or anything like that. And essentially, there's various metaphors to kind of like give you an intuition for what, a topological segmentation in a field might look like. A good intuition is if you kind of like think of the field lines as, yeah, kind of like, a race card or something, like, or like a little, yeah, I guess like indications for how to move. Ultimately, you can think of them as, okay, where the electron is being pushed towards. Well, a topological segmentation of the field would be one case where the field lines essentially loop around. And so they're not kind of like open or connecting to other objects, but they're creating a closed loop. So that if you're kind of like following the field lines, you will be trapped in there. And I think like that would be kind of like the simplest case, but like that kind of phenomenon is one where, hey, this property of the field, it doesn't depend on the observer. It doesn't depend on your interpretation. It's actually just there and it's happening. And on top of that, and here's kind of like the big thing that ties everything together, is that when you have these topological pockets, then that gives rise to phenomenons like resonance, that essentially within the pocket, the whole thing may actually vibrate as a unit, kind of in the same way that a guitar, because it's rigid, the sound of a guitar is kind of the vibrations of the entire guitar at once. When you have a topological pocket, the way it vibrates, it expresses the shape of the entirety of the pocket. So that is kind of like one way in which, okay, the actual topology of the field, the way it's partitioned, can be useful from the point of view of natural selection, can be used by biology for different purposes. And, ultimately, I suspect like topological pockets in fields will show up in biology, not only for consciousness, but for many other things. But especially for consciousness, I think that's going to be deciding like, okay, there's an actual objective boundary that is separating the part of the field that corresponds to your experience versus everything else.
Yeah, cool. So just to kind of replay that back, it's like, do you have? Yeah, it is funny because like we mostly think of like sticking on some brain waves or sticking on an EEG or whatever on someone's thing, and then you kind of read it off, and you're like, okay, cool. That's what's happening. It's like that. It is a read off of what's happening with the brain. But actually, what you're saying is that there's this, emphatic coupling or whatever, which is these local field potentials where, yeah, when you have it starts with like the neuron firing, but then you have 100 billion neurons in the brain or whatever, and so they're all doing stuff that's creating some kind of weird, you and I have these electric field potentials, just like whoa, 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 whoa. Kind of like the Earth has like a magnetic field, buzzing around it from all the iron inside. It's like we have this field potential, and that obviously has some causal weight back onto the neurons and how they're going to fire and all that kind of thing. So that kind of that makes some sense. And so now we have, and you can think of all these neurons that they're in this kind of field, and you have as you said, it can, in terms of needing to bind them all together. I love what you said. That's like, we're not binding. The binding problem with forces and particles is very hard to solve, but the boundary problem from a field perspective is easier because there are these like naturally occurring loops. And the way I kind of think about that, kind of from a macro perspective, is like a Friston adjacent perspective, is that there's a we just have these non-equilibrium steady states that exist in the world. And so some of them are something like the Earth orbiting around the sun, or the sun orbiting around the Milky Way. It's like those are that's in like a blob in equilibrium around a thing. And then similarly, like a fish moving through the ocean is kind of doing its own predictive processing, whatever, to like be like, I want to be in the water. I'm going to stay in the water. And then a bird does the same thing in the sky. And what I'm hearing from you to some extent here is that there are these when we have these field potentials, which is where these electrons are moving, these like probabilities of where they move, sometimes they create loops. And so sometimes they create these like little orbits that occur. And so once you get in an orbit, just like the Earth doesn't just randomly go shooting off somewhere random, it's like there's a thing that you can point at. That thing has a boundary. That thing is existing. We can point at it and give it a name, and we call that thing consciousness, or the feeling of blue, or whatever. Is that all? Is that kind of the? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah. And I mean, the last thing to wrap it up is, I mean, everything you said is a good a restatement of what I said is
Yep.
that when you have these boundaries, then you also have holistic behavior, like they act as a unit. And that's kind of like very helpful for like maintaining your own boundary, reducing your free energy. Like there's a kind of like a lot of things about like, hey, like if you can act in a coordinated fashion, right? Like it's not only about like, oh, like each of part is kind of like doing its own thing, but now the whole is acting as a unit. Yeah, that I think like has enormous evolutionary implications. I also wouldn't be terribly surprised if there's also like the more esoteric crazy part of this is probably like non-trivial topological pockets might even be like disembodied, but like still have like an evolutionary process where they're minimizing their own free energy, maintaining their own boundaries, forming coalitions, things like that. That might be happening in the sun. It's very speculative, but I think it's not impossible.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think you're right to say it's like, yeah, just thinking of them then as a unit, where it's like, okay, once a thing, we can point at the Earth and say, look, that's a unit. That's like a thing that seems to be acting a certain way, or like, look, that fish in the water, it kind of has a thing that it does. And so I think similarly, once you get something that starts looping, you're like, it starts to then other things are around it, and so they can kind of interact with each other, not at the kind of micro scale, but at the kind of quote unquote emergent macro scale. So I think so I guess one other question on this is, so this is so one frame on this is like you're a random guy in your bedroom or whatever, and like there's all these people that exist out there, and I know, and you have this amazing research lineages thing and all this stuff, but like how are you thinking about like, and this is a kind of a general question. I guess there's like a couple questions here, but one of them is like there's like the normal consciousness researchers, like the David Pierces and the whatever, the hard problem of consciousness guy and all that stuff. And so it's
Chalmers,
like how Chalmers, thank you. I was like, and another freaking David, so how you're a non-David trying to interact with like a system of philosophy and science and consciousness. How do you interact with them? How does this all work?
So tricky. Oh my goodness. I would say I am unbelievably grateful for the life path that I chose. However difficult this has been to get here, I would say it actually provides some affordances for doing research that would not be possible in academia and would not be possible in industry. Um, it's obviously was very unconventional for me to do this. To give you a sense, like I don't think I tell this to a lot of people, but like when I finished my master's, I talked to like probably about like 100 different like professors in a number of universities about consciousness. It's like, okay, like if I'm going to do a PhD on this, like who should I work with? And I was just unbelievably disappointed that like even those who expressed interest in consciousness, if you digged into actually what they were doing or caring about, they actually care about something adjacent to consciousness, like for example, like learning or memory or cognition or something like that. Um, Not like actually intrinsically motivated by things such as like, hey, hold on a second, but what is these Jana's states, or what are these, what is a DMT state of consciousness? That seems like really essential to make sense of these phenomena. That just wouldn't be a research topic I would be able to get an advisor on. At least, definitely not in 2013. Maybe times are changing. um, but essentially, yeah, kind of like, hey, if we actually want to tackle the problem, directly, not in just these circuitous routes, we need to essentially create a contingent of like really smart, dedicated people who like actually care about solving this problem specifically. And talking with like a few like friends, we co-founded the organization and essentially decided to, okay, like what intelligent, kind of informative, constructive, synergistic research lineages would essentially be able to come together to create these a new perspective on the science of consciousness. And yeah, that's how we arrived at the lineages. We've been slowly modifying them, updating them over time. Actually, I think like the vision for the lineages in the long term is going to be to have essentially kind of like the full graph of how people have influenced each other and like which parts are like really promising. um, I mean, things such as like caring about harmonic resonance, the binding problem, and valence are, yeah, I think like really, really critical. That's the other thing I didn't find in academia. It was people deeply caring about like valence as a research topic, and or prioritizing intense suffering or prioritizing extreme happiness as like a phenomena to understand. Completely
Hmm.
bare. I mean, again, like maybe times are changing, but definitely was not possible at the time.
And so
Yeah,
how are you like, well, so an A, just for anyone who's, and I'll put this in the show notes, but the research lineages are just, it's like, it is amazing. I love the research lineages. Let me just kind of pull them up because it's like a, it's just an amazing and I think that all anybody who does anything reasonable in the world who's trying to like push the frontier should have a page like this.
nice.
And
Yeah,
it has formalism lineages with like, you know, these David Marr and the three levels there, kind of the as you said, the Giulio Tonini, the kind of information theory stuff, Emily Noether with the kind of the gauge theory. So it all self-organization lineages, you know, Friston, you know, phenomenology, David Pearce, etc. And so you just like an amazing list of research lineages there. And so I guess, Andres, what I heard from you, and I experienced obviously the same thing, was going into academia and being like, oh, this isn't really, they're kind of not different incentive sets, not weird enough, whatever. Don't care enough about like maybe the true hard things that need to be solved. How do
yeah.
you but I guess I have a question for you, which is like, so you're out here being like, look, the binding problem, or we should think of the binding problem as a boundary problem. It's actually, let's talk about field behavior and, you know, electromagnetic stuff. So how will like, eventually do you like say, hey, not David Pierce, but the other David,
David Chalmers, yes.
David Chalmers, do you say, hey, Chalmers, like, yo, like, this is what I think, or like, how is your work going to relate to the more general field of consciousness science?
Yeah, look, well, I have the deeply held belief that if you do the work that you think that matters the most, eventually you will be able to sync up with others who are also in the same wavelength. I actually read that also from John Lilly, who, you know, he had like very unconventional path. I don't recommend his extreme drug use towards the end of his life or anything, but that's essentially something that he says in the Center of the Cyclone, I believe. He just says like, yeah, his life path, life career was choose to work on the things where he thought like he had a really good chance of making breakthroughs, and just assume that, yeah, other people will recognize them and sync up with them when the time comes. And I think that's kind of the strategy we've pursued. In practice, actually, a lot more people read our material than like people read academic philosophy of mind papers. If you know, look at what is the average number of times that a philosophy of mind, you know, paper
Two,
gets read.
you know,
Yeah,
two.
exactly. There you go. Whereas I don't know, I have like blog posts that have been read by like over 1 million people, right? Or like, so it's like, I think the strategy in terms at least of outreach definitely has worked pretty well. There's still so much more to go in that direction. But then in terms of kind of like, okay, like credibility markers, interfacing with a broader community, there's kind of like a couple approaches there. We are essentially starting to publish in academia. Last year we published the slicing problem. You can see on my Twitter the pinned post. It's kind of like a thank you, a thought experiment that I think like provides a really compelling reason to discard functionalism as a theory of consciousness, or at least like put it in question. And then we this year we're also we're aiming to publish the solution to the binding problem, and also like some yet unpublished, and we haven't discussed too much about this, but more research on valence specifically. But then I think like the most exciting part of kind of like how we're going to interface with science. I mean, of course, yeah, philosophy of mind, super essential, very important. Let's build the foundation. But then where I think like we will push the boundary really in a very substantial way is essentially by being able to make like predictions about how things such as psychophysics or perceptual tasks will behave on exotic states of consciousness. Um, One kind of empirical piece of work that we have here is called the tracer tool. We have this like method for essentially visualizing how visual tracers look like on psychedelics. That alone already has given us some like insights that in academia don't exist. For example, we have like ways to prove that DMT produces quote unquote very high frequency hallucinations. Essentially, the flickering rate is like much higher than on LSD. That just like shows up in our tracer tool, people replicating their DMT versus LSD. And like, that's a very concrete finding that absolutely publishable, is like the sort of thing, definitely should be in academic, psychedelic research. And we're moving in that direction. It's also the thing that allows us to collaborate with other labs because, how to say this, in consciousness research, the typical approach is to take a bunch of tests that were developed for people who are in normal states of consciousness, whether they're personality or perception tests, neuroimaging tests, and then, throw them at people who are in exotic states of consciousness, let's say on LSD or ketamine. But if you think about it, like, what are you going to learn by giving like an IQ test to somebody on ketamine, right? Like, they don't perform as well, but like, okay, what did you learn? Not very much.
They were on
Um,
ketamine, yeah.
yeah, exactly. So what we can add, the value add that I think is very substantial, and what motivates labs to actually collaborate with us, is that we can, because of the epistemology that we have, a network of really hardcore, technical, smart psychonauts and meditators, we can construct tests that actually measure something relevant, meaningful, and non-trivial about the state, that essentially you need to have experienced it to know in advance, hey, this is worth studying, right? It's kind of the tracer tool, right? Just from looking at questionnaire answers, you wouldn't know, hey, like DMT produces higher frequency stuff. You need to actually figure out that's something to study and then actually studying it. And likewise, we're developing a whole bunch, a whole bunch of like tracer tool like things in our toolkit, and I think that probably will be the most significant point of contact with the broader academic world.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. It's interesting because like, how to and I like what you're saying, and I pretty much believe the same thing, which is like find your niche, contribute to it, find your
Yep.
frontier, and just like be an awesome person that's like helping and building stuff and doing whatever's there. And then eventually you'll find the other people that are like, oh, you're also chatting about Friston stuff. What's up? Let's like get on a podcast together. And so it's like it's easy to then kind of collab. And I think it's cool. And I kind of think of it as like in some ways an academic paper. I think the reframe is like the academic paper is the intellectual exhaust of the actual work you're doing,
Mm.
where it's like
Mhm.
you're doing the actual work, you're doing thing, and then yes, it gets turned into a paper, and that paper gets submitted to a journal, and blah blah blah, and it goes through a more rigorous process, which is all. I think exhaust is a little bit too much of a straw man, but I think that's
Yeah.
roughly correct. And then really where you're at is being able to push on the kind of on valence, to push on these like predictive tools, to push with these this squad of psychonauts that you have. So I think that's interesting and cool, and I hope that it kind of that over time the field catches up or whatever. One other question I have for that before we go to the AI thing is like, tell us a little bit more about, because the QRI world is so funny because I remember when I first looked, up you guys up the webs, X amount of years ago, and I was like, who are these people? And Qualia Research Institute, that's what it stands for. And even the word qualia, you're like, what the hell is this thing? And then so you kind of dive deeper, and you got all these weird kind of images and colors and stuff. And then you're like, okay, and the thing I mostly took away is just like, okay, it seems like they like to do psychedelics, like that. And some of the energy. And so, but tell us more about how you. But I actually think it's a really smart frame, which is how do you kind of use psychedelics as part of your like research program to try to find out like what, or is there anything especially interesting with DMT or whatever that you've learned recently that's like can kind of help us understand how it helps to do psychedelics and study consciousness?
Yeah. I mean, we have a guide called Guide to Writing Useful or Scientifically Helpful Trip Reports, which kind of like, how to say this, like there's like millions of trip reports out there, but most of them focus on the narrative content, essentially like, hey, this is what happened, then this entity told me this, and then it made me think about my grandmother, and then whatever, just like the path of like what happened is kind of like what people over focus on for very sensible human reasons. It's kind of like what really had kind of an emotional grip, obviously. But that's not very helpful because let's say the same narrative can arise from like salvia or DMT. In both cases, you might have like met a dragon and then like, talk to the mantis people, but the texture of the experience was completely different, right? So the narrative doesn't capture what we think is actually the most substantial, the most important. So we have kind of these like focus on what we call the phenomenal character, like what the experience feels like in very precise, technical, accurate terms. A very big inspiration for this is Daniel Ingram, who wrote Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. The way he describes like meditation states in that book is like top notch. I would say he's like a world class phenomenologist for meditation. A lot of kind of like the psychedelic work at QRI, interviewing these like really advanced mathematicians and physicists who also happen to be psychonauts. Really, the conversations focus on the phenomenal content. Of course, we might talk about some personal stuff, but it's really okay. Like the juicy stuff is, hey, in what way did these have any relationship with anything mathematical that you may know of, or you may have experienced before, you may be working on? And essentially, yeah, we've developed this overarching framework where we can explain a lot of things in exotic states of consciousness in terms of there's several buzzwords, but one of them is psychedelic thermodynamics, like the energy flow in the system, what functions as energy sources, what functions as energy sinks. I think has enormous explanatory power. Annealing, for those who are curious, look up neural annealing, and also its application for healing trauma. And so like things like that, very unique perspective. I think like very fresh. Nobody's, as far as I know, kind of like using this kind of angle. Very on top of my head, something that I'm thinking of obsessively these days is because I have like some very credible, reports. Recently, I've interviewed some like really credible. I mean, one of them was like an MIT, math professor for a while, and like only started taking psychedelics in his 40s. But essentially, yeah, people of that type of caliber have recently told me that yeah, they've had like some very clear experiences where they experience not only hyperbolic geometry. I'm very convinced of that. I've presented a lot of arguments for hyperbolic geometry on DMT. I think that's a very solid case. But the more exotic kind of like new stuff is higher dimensions. And essentially, there does seem to be some four-dimensional behavior, like orthogonal rotations, that can get activated on the right dose of DMT. And it's not any dose. It cannot be too little or too much. There's kind of like a window for that level where like that behavior happens. And right now, yeah, I'm just kind of obsessively trying to figure out how to how to prove this. What kind of a task would show, hey, this person is actually embodying a 4D rotation, and like if we could do that this year, I would be ecstatic.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's a great kind of, it's just like the world of psychedelics overall is just obviously a frontier in different ways, and it's sad that we're 50 years behind it, and that it can do all this help with PTSD
Yeah.
and trauma and stuff. And it's like you have the pure kind of simple recreational frame, then you have these more kind of narrative, how to change your mind frames, which are like, oh, like how do you change, like you're like, how do I like recover from my mom's death or whatever, and so like and then this one that you're talking about is like, yeah, just stick a bunch of physicists and mathematicians, have them do it, and then chat with them in a very kind of rigorous manner about their experience, and then really try to get to the qualia level, the phenomenological level, and how to show that. So I think that's juicy and exciting. And if anybody's listening who has experienced these 4D states on DMT, definitely hit up Andres,
Yes.
and if you want to go deeper on that. So Andres, I want to ask in the kind of the last kind of 10 minutes we have here about artificial intelligence and whether that can be can exhibit consciousness or whatever, because we're getting we're moving quickly, blah blah blah, we'll all be killed by AGI within but maybe, hopefully not, and you had a tweet recently that was like, as long as we use digital computers, large language models like ChatGPT or whatever, will never be conscious. So tell
Right.
us why that's true.
Totally. So I mean, computers are conscious, but they're not conscious in the sense that the programs that they're running actually come together to form, data structures that themselves kind of like, there's no consciousness that is tracking the programs. There's no consciousness that is tracking the algorithms that the machines are running. There is consciousness at the microscopic level. I mean, I do think a transistor is actually made of qualia because of, dual aspect monism, panpsychism is part of the field of consciousness. That I don't have any problems with that. But then there's no kind of like a automatic, looping structure of the fields that will arise simply because you're computing the bits in a certain way. The looping structures really will have mostly to do with the hardware structure and the hardware design, very little to do with the actual algorithm that is being performed. And so, like, I think, if you were to analyze from a Qualia field perspective, like a computer, you would see like a lot of interesting, strange experiences in there, but they would have nothing to do with a chatbot. There's probably like a flavor of experience that has to do with a hard drive, and one flavor of experience having to do with the caches, but probably nothing related to kind of an integrated, world model that comes together to produce these answers. And so, but that doesn't mean that you cannot create a, non-trivial bound experience with artificial hardware. I think you can. It just has to be very special hardware. And for better or worse, it will have, I think, like computational advantages. So like in the long run, I do expect people to essentially create sentient machines, even if they're just motivated by computation, right? Like even if they just don't care about consciousness, they will stumble upon the tricks, such as phenomenal binding and holistic field behavior for computation. And what I'm really trying to kind of like get ahead, one of the reasons I'm trying to get ahead of the curve here is that essentially, I think it's going to be really, really important that if and when we make actual sentient machines, that they are essentially using only positive valence, that kind of they are animated by information gradients of bliss, because otherwise it's just yet another way in which consciousness can get enslaved for other purposes. It would be terrible if the world ends up being, a few million people happy, but then trillions of like really miserable sentient machines that we have enslaved for our purposes. In the end, we're all the same field, right? Like, so that would be us doing it to ourselves, like whether we realize it or not, which is incredibly tragic. But I mean, essentially having a theory for, okay, what kind of field configurations corresponds to a happy state. I think it's very essential to be prepared for when that actually starts happening. I don't anticipate holistic field behavior to be used in computing for a couple decades, but I think it's going to happen.
Interesting. So let me kind of pop that. So it's what I'm hearing is like, as we start to map the ideas of the the boundary problem and the the field behavior and holistic field behavior and these like little looping things, as we map that into computers, we start to say, okay, if you're running, you can look at something like a hard drive or something like these caches in RAM, the kind of the kind of short-term versus long-term memory. You could look at something like that and you could say, oh, the hard drive is experiencing some kind of looping adjacent stuff where it is kind of moving around a similar state where what it does is it puts stuff into this little spot in the memory and then pulls it out, and then it like puts it back in over here and then it pulls it out or whatever. And if you look at the thing enough, you're like, oh, that kind of looks like a little orbiting blob, a little looping thing, a little thing with a boundary. And so we might call that thing conscious. Is that right? Like, what is that? How is that conscious? And why this makes me feel like IIT vibes, these integrated information theory, which is just like, just shut up and compute and like, look, that's a conscious thing. I'm like, wait, why is the hard drive conscious? So tell me, why is the hard drive in this little loop conscious, and how does that relate to my consciousness of blue?
Yes, I mean, I would buy the bullet in this case, but unlike IIT, you don't get like an insane number of paradoxes, and well. One very strange thing about like hardware consciousness is that the actual shape of the field is approximately epiphenomenal. Like there's a lot of the shape of the field that doesn't feed back into the further behavior of the hard drive. Whereas I think like where consciousness shines is when actually there's like some kind of equalization that happens of forces of a large experience that sort of like is simultaneously taking together a lot of information and then prioritizing something as being salient. And that is a case where like the actual holistic nature of consciousness is being useful. But it doesn't mean that you need useful holistic consciousness to have consciousness. You can still have like, yeah, kind of, okay, it's making these loops. The loops are not very causally significant, but they're still there. And they're still segmenting the universal field of consciousness. So yeah, they're just as much, yeah, particles in the body of the divine as we are, as it were.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we don't need to double click on that too much, but I think, yeah, it's kind of like, and this happens with any kind of, as you push the edges of any kind of like claims, it's like, okay, like IIT might experience this worse, and like, and you're experiencing it too bad, but it's like, it's like, okay, why is this? And I hear what you're saying, which is that if the as the thing gets more and more holistic, and as it kind of self determines the stuff to take as input to then like determine where it should continue to self replicate or whatever, that kind of a thing is kind of quote unquote more conscious, but versus the other stuff which is less consciousy, but it's kind of a gradient of consciousnessy. And then what I'm hearing as well is like, yeah, this artificial that the, as you said, these are there's going to be some convergently evolved or kind of some kind of like forced moves, inevitable moves in design space. What I'm hearing, and that like force us to like, that want holistic field behavior, that want us to kind of
Yeah.
have this like state of thing that says like, okay, it worked for humans, and it's probably going to be a thing that works for AI as well. And that if and when we
Yeah.
have that, we want it to be a positive thing, because we don't want just a couple a billion humans and then a trillion kind of sad machines. So that feels like a
Yep.
good research direction, and I'm excited for that. As a final kind of question I have here is, I guess, Andres, we'll do a little bit of overrated, underrated at the end, but like my first other question is, what advice do you have for ambitious young people who want to get into the field of consciousness?
Oh, amazing. I mean, this is very standard advice, but hey, look, I think what I've heard from a lot of professors, and I have found this to be also true in at QRI with like interns and like contractors, employees, is that essentially, um, if you kind of like look at neuroscience PhDs, you will kind of like see a bimodal distribution in their capabilities, where essentially I mean, this is kind of sad. I don't mean to dunk on anybody, but okay, like just kind of very realistically, like essentially, those who studied something like computer science or math as their undergraduates or during their masters are like so much better equipped to start a neuroscience PhD than those who actually studied neuroscience as an undergraduate, right? Because all of the parts of the brain and how they're connected and so on are things you can pick up over time, but there is a kind of like critical window where like, hey, all this technical stuff, it would be good for your brain to kind of like sit down and learn it now. So that would be my advice. Like, again, like not like a STEM supremacist or something like that, but like do try to pick kind of the most technical field you're capable of and motivated to do, and think of that as essentially kind of empowering your future research. Because yeah, I mean, hiring somebody who's been reading a lot of neuroscience versus hiring somebody who has read neuroscience on the side but is actually like a hardcore like signal processing expert, it's just in general so much more empowering. So
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's good advice. I think that there's and I like it as you said. It's just like, choose the highest level that you can go. And I know for me personally, I
yeah.
was a computer science major or whatever, but I didn't really like graduate school stuff, and I don't really love like the more intense physics or whatever. So it's like, I chose computer science, and that was good, and it helped me. Now I don't really do much computer science, but I can always kind of use it within my life, and so it's a helpful tool. And so just like pushing yourself on writing or math or whatever, it's kind of like a helpful tool. So that makes sense. And I have another question for you, Andres, actually, before we go to overrated, underrated. What is your production function? Like, do you wake up in the morning? Do you just like take a bunch of DMT and then like write some papers? Like, what's kind of what do you what how do you produce stuff on the world?
Such a good question. I hear from people that they perceive me as prolific. Like, as some people say that, my subjective feeling is that I'm like drastically underachieving. Like, that's maybe they come together. I don't know, but but that is my subjective feeling of my productivity. I do try to get articles out at least once a couple weeks. Like videos, writings, making progress on papers. One thing that has helped enormously is I have this rule, which is, and I recommend this to anybody who's like serious about like getting more writing done, it's before you tackle any other task in the day, to spend 15 minutes writing. And I don't mean like writing in the sense of like, oh, like editing or like looking for sources or quotes or something like that. Like, no, new words. Just get new words out every day. Build that as a habit. And little by little, you actually go very far with that. Like, you all of a sudden you realize, wow, I have like 50 pages written on this topic, and it's only been like a week because I followed this path. Other than that, yeah, I'm doing kind of like a push on like more DACA on things like meditation and exercise, but we'll probably see the fruits of that in a while.
Nice.
Yeah, I definitely also prioritize my sleep quite a bit. I'm probably one of the like definitely I never find myself undersleeping, although I might oversleep a little bit. But just I notice that like if I don't sleep enough, that's absolutely killer for the higher level cognition and actually doing progress. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's yeah, I remember when I was starting to do some meditation like 5 years ago or whatever, and it was like I was sleeping, 7.5 hours a night, and I was and that was good. But then I as I was meditating, I was falling asleep, and the little book
Yeah.
was telling me, it was like, hey, if you're falling asleep while meditating, that means you need to sleep more, And so then
Yeah.
I went from 7.5 to 8, and now I'm perfect, And so, but if I don't get my 8, then I'm kind of a worthless human, and so that makes sense. And I love the the write every day, and then you will actually have a lot. I'm in a writing club, and this woman has 100,000
Oh,
words because she's
great.
been in this like write every day kind of energy. Let's do a
Yeah.
final little thing of overrated, underrated. So I'm going to name a thing, and then you're going to say kind of a quick like, hey, is it overrated or underrated, and like one sentence on why.
Perfect.
So what is the hard problem of consciousness? Is that overrated or underrated?
Overall, I would say drastically underrated in that it's probably the most important philosophical question, but it is overrated as a frame. We have a much better frame. Mike came up with the 8 subproblems of consciousness, or David Pearce's 4 subproblem. Look up breaking down the problem of consciousness in qualia computing. It's so much more clarifying. It helps you actually solve the problem. But I think you do need the hard problem of consciousness first to realize, oh my God, this is very weird. So in that sense, drastically underrated in general.
Cool. Yep. Got it. Underrated, but yeah, the frame is a little bit overrated. What
Yeah,
about Friston's free energy principle?
I would say appropriately rated. Is that an answer I can give?
No, you're
I mean,
forced
I
to do
think.
one or the other.
Oh, okay. Then I would say overrated because the main. I mean, I would say like everybody would benefit. Every academic would benefit from like looking into it and thinking more about it and applying it to a lot of domains, even things such as like air currents and like erosion patterns, and like you can apply it in a lot of places. It's super fun, but it doesn't solve the binding problem. It doesn't solve consciousness. And there's a lot of people who are actually under the delusion that the free energy principle is a theory of consciousness, which it absolutely is not. So in that sense, overrated.
Nice, nice. You're hurting my feelings as I as a,
No.
free energy principle maximalist over here. Oh, I'm so sad. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much, Andres. If you want to check out Andres's stuff online, he's on Twitter at ALGEKALIPSO. Alligacalypso? Calypso? What is
Yes.
that?
It's my
How
initials,
do you
and
say
then I say Alge Calypso. Calypso is just
Algicalypso?
was my nickname when I was a kid. So
Got it. Algae Calypso, like a algae and then Calypso kind of. And then also check out Qualia Research Institute. That's qri.org. Nice. You got a good domain name. And yeah, if you're a
yep.
person out there who's excited by consciousness, who's excited by the fundamental nature of reality, who's excited by how psychedelics and or meditation kind of affect these things, or if you're excited by kind of a more physics and mathematical frame on this, definitely kind of check them out, see if you can get involved, that kind of thing. Anything else, Andres, that you want to say to myself or the listeners today?
No, I mean, if you're very excited on these topics, and especially if you're like are like have a substantial meditation or psychedelic experience and you're in technical fields, reach out, because yeah, we're trying to grow the network and essentially conduct completely above board legal experiments on these domains. So a lot of exciting news are going to be released in the future. But yeah, definitely reach out. We'd be very happy to chat.
Boom. That sounds perfect. And with that, thank you so much. Thank you, Andres, for coming today. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Goodbye. And as you say, infinite bliss, baby.
Infinite bliss.
Let's. Thanks so much for listening today. If you liked the show, please give us a 5-star podcast review or subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to chat about this episode with a community of amazing, smart, ambitious, divergent people, come on by and join our Discord. You can find it at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. And then finally, if you'd like to contribute to these ideas being shared more widely in society, you can support the podcast production team at patreon.com/Rhys Lindmark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Thanks, and see you here for the next episode. Bye.